So here we are at the second part of the market revolution and Jacksonian democracy. This part is going to be about the democracy aspect of it. In particular, more men became able to vote during this time period. Now, we had talked about, during the revolution, we talked about the democratization of freedom and how some states, right after the revolution, when they're writing up their first state constitutions, had removed the old property requirements. And in the case of Vermont, had removed the property owning requirements and also taken away the tax paying requirement. So every free man in Vermont could vote. But there were still some states that hadn't done that yet. And so in the 1800s, really starting at about the 1820s, we see these grassroots, common people-led movements to expand democracy in those states that hadn't already done it. Every state that entered the Union after the Revolution automatically allowed all free adult white men to vote, regardless of property. But in the older states, in states like Virginia and Rhode Island, they start to hold constitutional conventions to rewrite their state constitutions during the 1820s and 1830s to address these demands. Part of it is a practical question. As industry expands, that increases the number of wage earners and decreases the percentage of the population who owns land. And so the increasing number of men who could not meet the property requirements insisted that they were just as fit to exercise their rights as propertied men were. And the pressure from those men, those poor men, is what increased American democracy. Now in 1829, Virginia held a constitutional convention to talk about rewriting their state constitution. And a group of landless men sent a petition to that convention saying that owning property did not make a man more intelligent or more moral than anyone else, didn't give you more civic virtue than anyone else. And they said that even though they themselves did not own land, they were still, good men and smart men, and they want their rights. They said that if they weren't allowed a say in the government, then it wasn't government by consent of the governed, and they're not truly free. By the time they sent that convention petition, 1829, Virginia was one of only 3 states that still had property qualifications. The big slave owners who dominated Virginia politics fought very hard against demands for more democracy. And this petition in 1829 was not successful. It wasn't until the 1850s that Virginia finally got rid of their property qualifications. Now, the speed of change varied considerably in the old states. But by 1860, all of them except one had ended the property requirements. Now, some states continued to bar men from voting if they received any kind of what they called poor relief, public assistance, on the grounds that those men were not independent men. Now, the idea of the independent citizen is still important. But remember, in the 16 and 1700s, that had been so closely tied to land ownership. In the 1800s, being independent is less about owning land and more about owning yourself, controlling yourself. The last holdout, the last exception to this trend toward more democracy was Rhode Island. Rhode Island required voters to own real estate worth $134 or rent property for at least $7 a year, which sounds like nothing to us, but back then that was not cheap, particularly because Rhode Island was losing landowners. Rhode Island is a New England state, and it, like all of the other New England states, was becoming increasingly industrialized. It had more and more factory workers, and factory workers rented rooms in cheap company-owned boarding houses. They didn't own property, and they didn't even rent nice property. In October of 1841, men who supported reform petitioned the government, the state government in Rhode Island, to change the state constitution to get rid of the property qualifications. They were led by a man named Thomas Dorr, and Rhode Island, of course, rejected that. So then these reformers, who are mostly poor men, organized what they called a People's Convention. They drafted a new state constitution. This new constitution enfranchised all adult white men, regardless of property ownership. But it also eliminated all voting rights for African Americans. Up to this point in Rhode Island, African Americans could vote if they met the same property requirements as white men did. So then the reformers, this People's Convention, they sent their new constitution to the state legislature and essentially said, look, we did all the work for you. We wrote this thing for you. All you have to do is ratify it. And the state ignored them again. So at this point, they decided that the state government no longer had consent of the governed, by which they meant the majority of poor folks in Rhode Island. So they decided to set up their own state government, one that was technically not legal, but in the eyes of the reformers was more legitimate than the official state government. So they set up essentially this people's government, this sort of shadow government. They ratified their constitution. They chose Thomas Dorr to be their governor. And of course, that opened up a whole can of worms. This is an anti-Dorr cartoon. Shows Thomas Dorr up here in the upper right, being carried, floated along by sort of the rabble. You notice he's got cloven hooves here. That, in part, refers to the idea that the devil is, pushing them along. He's got his whip here, the devil, and he's whipping the regular folks, the common folks of Rhode Island, up into a frenzy, and Thomas Dorr is suspended on his horns. But cloven hooves were also a symbol of abolitionists. Now, whether Thomas Dorr was an abolitionist or not, we don't really know. Many people who were didn't really go public with it very much back then, especially not if they wanted to hold political office. But just the accusation that Dorr might be an abolitionist was enough to turn a lot of people against him. Now, President Tyler sent in federal troops to stop the Dorr Rebellion. The movement collapsed. Dorr spent nearly 2 years in prison for treason, which is, to be honest, not a bad outcome for him. Typically, when you commit treason, especially back here, they'd just hang you. Dorr got to live. But the Dorr War, the Dorr Rebellion, showed how contentious and how potentially violent this voting rights issue could become. Soon after Dorr was arrested, the Rhode Island legislature, the official legal Rhode Island legislature, eliminated the property qualifications for all native-born men, including African Americans. Rhode Island kept the property qualifications for naturalized immigrants, though. If you were an immigrant and you lived in Rhode Island and you became a U.S. citizen, you still had to own a certain amount of property. They won't change that until the 1880s. By 1840, despite fights and restrictions still going on in some states, a majority of white men were able to vote. American politics were boisterous and very partisan and sometimes violent, and they engaged massive numbers of citizens. The United States was intended to be a nation state. It's supposed to be held together by the strength of our shared belief in Republican democracy and the Constitution. Alexis de Tocqueville had a lot to say about this. He's that Frenchman that visited the United States and then wrote about how strange we were in his point of view. He said that to understand America, you have to understand America's particular democracy. Now, Tocqueville didn't really like democracy that much. He was an aristocrat himself. But he did actually seem to understand American-style democracy pretty well. He said that democracy in America didn't just mean the right to vote. He said that democracy was a habit of the heart, that it's this whole culture that allows and encourages individual initiative and an active public sphere filled with all kinds of citizens who want to improve society and at least a little bit of equality. And he said that that kind of democracy was essential to American freedom. And democracy really did build up a sense of equality among people who could participate. But it deepened the divide between those who could and those who couldn't. Being able to take part in elections and in the pageantry that surrounds them, the parades and the bonfires and the mass meetings and the conventions, that helped to define who the people of the United States were. The right to vote increasingly became the symbol of citizenship. Now, in the law, voting was still technically a privilege, not a right. But in the common usage, in the way that most people talked about it, the term citizen was synonymous with having the right to vote. A voting rights activist said that suffrage was the mark of liberty and the only true badge of the free man. By the 1830s, by the time that Andrew Jackson is president, the idea that voting meant the people was almost universally accepted in the United States. But if voting equals the people, if voting and participation in politics were so central to our identity as the people, then it also became very important to define the boundaries. Who are the people and who are not. A democracy in America could absorb native-born white men, rich and poor, and waves of European immigrants, but there were, at this point, impenetrable barriers to non-white men and to women of all races. The U.S. Magazine was a pre-Civil War one of the biggest circulation magazines in the United States. In 1851, they published an article which said that universal suffrage means that white men are the political nation. But how can the word universal be reconciled with only allowing a very small percentage of people to participate? White men are not a majority of the nation. First of all, men were not a majority of the nation. 51% of the population was female. So automatically, universal suffrage is cut down to just 49%. And then 20% of the population was black. So you've got, 49% now, now down to 29%. And then, of course, over the age of 20. So that's going to be, we'll say, about half. So now we're looking at 14.5%, and then there are still some states that are holding out for landowners and taxpayers. So we're looking at maybe 11-12% of the population who can vote, but we're calling that universal suffrage. As democracy expanded, the justification for limiting universal suffrage to such a small percentage shifted away from economic dependency, which is what the justification used to be in the 1600s and 1700s, and the justification shifted instead toward claiming that some people were naturally incapable of exercising democracy. There was a very rigid hierarchy of what they said were inborn abilities, with white men at the top and women of color at the bottom. Men who were involved in politics, the political leaders, said that they didn't mean to be exclusionary. They weren't deliberately excluding people, of course not. It's just that nature has excluded those people by making them silly and irrational and just not capable of understanding. And yet this is the heyday of individualism, the idea that everyone should be able to develop themselves and their potential But in practice, only white men can do that. Society believed that white men could grow in all sorts of directions, but black men, native men, women of any race, were viewed as kind of stuck the way that nature made them. The market revolution and political democracy did produce a big expansion of the public sphere. Remember, the public sphere is that part of politics that isn't done by elected officials. The public sphere is us sitting around and talking about politics, debating different issues, and complaining about our politicians. We're the public sphere. And this expansion in the early 1800s opened the door for some limited public participation by women. There was a tremendous growth in publishing during this era. There was the mass circulation penny press. Presses became steam-powered, and so pamphlets and books became really cheap to produce. And so all sorts of magazines and travel guides and advice manuals, often written by women, were published. This expansion of publishing and the growth of literacy opened the door for a new generation of women writers, like Lydia Maria Child. We've talked about her before. Catherine Maria Sedgwick and Catherine Beecher and other women published stories and poetry and essays and guides to domestic life. And the growth of religious movements and reform movements that also created a space for women to participate, not necessarily in politics, but in the public sphere. But still, women were denied the right to vote. A delegate from Virginia said that God created women weak and timid, and so they ought to be controlled by men. He also said that the right to vote implied intelligence, so obviously women were incapable. The political world was defined in part in contrast to the private female sphere of the home. There was no even implied public freedoms for women. Beyond the right to decent treatment by her husband, which was defined differently everywhere, a woman had no rights that the public had to respect. Now, the exclusion of women is a very long-standing practice. But the growing exclusion of African American men was kind of a new thing in some states. Tocqueville pointed out that by the 1830s, equality had become an American obsession. White Americans of all classes wore the same styles, they traveled in the same coaches and railroad cars, they stayed in the same hotels. But at the same time, Black Americans were increasingly considered a group apart. Very racist imagery became the stock in trade of popular culture during this era. We see things like minstrel shows, minstrel, minstrel shows, where white actors would put on blackface and play African American characters as stupid and dishonest and ridiculous. And those shows were very popular and remained very popular into the early 20th century. American writers tended to either ignore Black Americans or show them only in stereotypes. And if you're reading a pre-Civil War novel, you can kind of guess where the writer's from by how they handle Black characters. So if a Black character is a happy but ignorant and superstitious slave, then the writer is probably Southern. If the Black character is a long-suffering, devout Christian slave, then the writer's probably from the North. I can only really think of one white American writer who deals with Black characters as if they're real people, who writes them, the same way that he would write white characters, and that's Herman Melville, of all people. He's the guy who wrote Moby Dick, and there are actually a couple of Black characters in that book, but he specifically wrote one novel, Benito Cereno, which is about a rebellion on a slave ship. So all of the major characters in that book are Black, And he's really the only one who handles them in any kind of a, from our perspective, reasonable and humane way. So even our entertainment is becoming increasingly racist, and so is the political system. The tentative steps toward freedom that were made during the Revolutionary era between 76 and 99, those steps are cut off. White Americans in the early 1800s developed an almost rabid ideology of racial superiority and inferiority, complete with what they called scientific evidence. And that affected who could participate in the political nation. During the Revolutionary era, from 1776 to about 1799, only Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia had laws that explicitly barred black men from voting. As late as 1800, no northern states specifically had laws against black voting. But every state that entered the Union after 1800, except for Maine, limited the vote only to white men. And beginning with Kentucky in 1799 and Maryland in 1801, states that used to allow African Americans to vote began to revoke that privilege. In 1821, the state of New York had a constitutional convention. They got rid of the property qualifications for white men. They raised the property qualifications for black men. They raised it to $250 worth of property, which was completely out of the reach of most of the men in New York. But that law now only applied to black men. North Carolina disenfranchised their freedmen in 1835. Pennsylvania, which had a really vibrant free community, they did the same thing in 1838. One delegate to that Pennsylvania convention was Thaddeus Stevens. He refused to sign it. And later, he will become one of the leaders of the abolition movement. He'll support equal rights after the Civil War. If you watch that Spielberg movie that came out a couple years ago, Lincoln, about the 13th Amendment, Tommy Lee Jones plays Thaddeus Stevens in that movie, and the resemblance is kind of scary. By 1860, there were only 5 states left that allowed African American men to vote on the same basis as white men. Now, I don't want to give you the idea that during the Revolutionary generation there was total equality, because you know that's not true. But despite the problems and despite the inequalities, many white Americans of the Revolutionary generation had thought of African Americans as potential citizens, as potential members of the political nation. But as the 1800s go on, the definition of the political nation became more and more associated with whiteness. The federal government barred free black men from service in the federal army or in the state militias. No state gave freedmen true equality before the law. In Illinois, which is a northern state, African Americans couldn't vote, couldn't testify or sue in court, couldn't serve in the militia, couldn't attend public schools. One political leader in Minnesota said that black people were not Americans, but were, I quote, intruders among us. It's pretty frickin' rich when a group of people can forcibly kidnap a man away from his home and then call him the intruder. In effect, race had replaced class as the boundary between those American men who were we the people and those who were not. The focus on race limited America's political community, but it did help to solidify a sense of commonness and equality and national identity among white American men. In a country where the right to vote had become so central, not just to the meaning of freedom, but to the essence of citizenship, it's difficult to overstate the importance of the fact that in some states, white male immigrants were allowed to vote before they even became citizens, while in nearly all states, free black men who had been born here, whose parents and grandparents had probably been born here, couldn't vote at all. Now, after the War of 1812, we saw a real growth of nationalist pride. But the war also showed how far the U.S. was from being a truly unified nation. We'd lost the Bank of the United States a year before the war started, so we didn't have a unified currency. It was almost impossible to raise money for the war. And with the, at that point, primitive state of transportation, it was very difficult to move men and goods around the country. One shipment of supplies during the war from New England took 75 days to reach New Orleans. Now, when peace came, small American manufacturers who had started to develop during the war, while we didn't have foreign trading competition, they now have to compete again with foreign-made goods. A younger generation of politicians, led by Henry Clay and John Calhoun, believed that these infant American industries need government protection. They do like the old Jeffersonian idea of agriculture, but they also said that agriculture needed to go along with manufacturing if the U.S. wants to be financially strong. We started to see a little bit of this happening while Jefferson was still president, right? In 1806, we see Congress approving the building of the National Road. In 1808, Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury had outlined this plan for the federal government to essentially tie the nation together by building roads and canals up and down the eastern seaboard, and by connecting the Atlantic coast with the Great Lakes, with the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. That didn't get off the ground. It was a powerful idea, but it was only an idea until after the War of 1812. In his annual message to Congress in 1815, President Madison talked about his blueprint for the government to support economic development. And this plan came to be known as the American System. The American System is a political program for federally sponsored economic growth. This plan, Madison's American System, rested on 3 pillars. First, a new national bank. Second, a tariff on imported goods to protect those little American industries. And third, the federal government will build roads and canals. That last was drawn from Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, his plan that he'd written nearly 10 years before. And that last part, the roads and canals, was considered particularly important. Madison and Clay and Calhoun all worked together on this, and they believed that that in particular, the transportation, the roads and canals, that is needed to tie the country together. Now, obviously, the strict constructionists throw a big old fit. Jefferson's still alive at this point, he really does not like this plan because the Constitution doesn't specifically say that Congress can charter a national bank again. You know, he fussed with Hamilton over that the first time. And the Constitution doesn't specifically say that the federal government can build roads and canals or anything else. And Calhoun actually responded to Jefferson on that, because Calhoun is the kind of person who will respond to every criticism. And he responded to Jefferson by saying, if we are restricted to our enumerated powers, on what principle can you justify the purchase of Louisiana? Jefferson? How can you do that? Explain that. But those government-sponsored roads and canals ended up being the most controversial part of the plan. Congress passed this whole internal improvements plan that was drafted by Clay and Calhoun with Madison's approval, and then they were astonished when Madison vetoed it. Madison kind of hero worships Thomas Jefferson. He's a political disciple of Jefferson. You know, when he was a young man, Jefferson kind of took him under his wing, got him involved in Virginia politics. And so when former President Jefferson leans heavily on current President Madison, Madison decides to veto the roads and canals. Now, the other two parts of the plan, the tariff and the Second Bank of the United States, they did become law. The tariff of 1816 was meant to protect any good that could be produced in the United States, especially cotton textiles. And then in 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was chartered for another 20 years. So what that means is, in 1836, Congress will have to reauthorize the charter, or the Second Bank will cease to exist. Now, the Second Bank of the United States became the focal point of a lot of resentment. Very much like the First Bank, it was a private, profit-making corporation that worked as the government's financial agent. It issued paper money, it collected taxes, it paid the government's debts. It was also supposed to ensure that any paper money issued by local banks had real value. By this point, there are more than 200 local banks across the country. Those banks helped to finance manufacturing. They loaned money to farmers to buy land and goods, and in many places, slaves. Those local banks also printed paper money. Now today, only the Federal Reserve issues paper money, and the amount that they print is determined by the chairman of the Federal Reserve. That is a government agency. But in the 1800s, there really weren't restrictions in the United States on who could print paper money. The paper money was supposed to be on the gold standard, supposed to be based on gold. So the paper money would be these notes that would promise to pay the bearer a specified amount of specie, gold or silver. And in fact, you may have, or older relatives may still have, silver certificates from the early part of the 20th century that say on them, pay the bearer on demand this amount of silver. That's what all of the paper money said in the 1800s. Pay the bearer on demand this amount of specie, gold or silver. Now, when you print that money, you are supposed to have that amount of specie, that amount of gold or silver, in your vaults. So if the main Bank of Portland issues $10 in paper money, they are supposed to have $10 in gold in the vault. But local banks often printed way more money than they actually had specie to back it up. So the value of paper money just fluctuated wildly. The Bank of the United States was supposed to keep a handle on this, supposed to prevent those local banks from going too crazy with their paper money. So what they would do, what they were supposed to do, was the Bank of the United States would buy up as much paper money from a specific bank as they could, and then they would go to that bank and present the paper money and say, do you have this specie? You know, if we turn this money in, this paper money in, can you pay us, the bearer, this amount in specie? And if the bank didn't have that specie on hand, then they're going to collapse. That's what the Bank of the United States is supposed to do. That is not what they actually did. I know it's super shocking that a bank is going to screw up and not do what they're supposed to do, but instead of regulating the currency and the loans by the local banks, the Second Bank of the United States was a part of this speculative fever that swept the country. After the War of 1812, when we started trading with Europe again, there was a huge overseas market for American cotton and American grain. To keep up with that demand, American farmers wanted to buy more land to plant. They demanded loans to buy these things, and the local banks and the Bank of the United States were only too happy to print more and more money so our farmers can buy land. But early in 1819, the European demand for American produce dropped back to pre-war levels. So our economic bubble burst. The demand for land fell. Speculators lost millions. At this time, loans weren't like 30-year mortgages with the payments all spread out. In the early 1800s, loans were much shorter term, and banks could demand full payment at any time. So the Bank of the United States began demanding payments from its lendees. Local banks can't pay it. They start demanding full payment from local farmers and local businessmen that they've loaned money to, and the farmers and businessmen can't pay that. So the farmers and the small businesses declare bankruptcy. Some of the local banks are completely crushed. Unemployment starts to rise, and it turns into a panic. It's called the Panic of 1819. That lasted for not much more than a year, but it severely disrupted the political harmony that we had been having up to that point. The people who suffered the most from the downturn put a lot of pressure on the state governments and on the federal government to help. Some states, especially the frontier states, just completely suspended debt collection. Like if you're a merchant and all of the area farmers and families have been buying at your store on credit, you cannot demand payment from them. Oh, that's not good. Then those merchants start to go under. Kentucky went really far. Kentucky established a state bank that just flooded the state with new money, which had zero gold to back it up. That eased the burden on the farmers who were in debt, but it injured those who had loaned them the money in the first place. Overall, the panic deepened many people's distrust of banks. It severely undermined the reputation of the Second Bank of the United States, which was widely blamed for causing the panic. Several states retaliated against the bank by trying to tax its local branches, and well, those tax laws produced another of the Marshall Court's landmark cases. John Marshall is still Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this point. And the case I'm specifically talking about is McCulloch v. Maryland. McCulloch v. Maryland. In that decision, the Supreme Court said that states cannot tax federal agencies. And with this decision, Chief Justice Marshall once again went beyond the bare facts of the case to make a broader declaration, just like he had done in Marbury v. Madison. In this case, Marshall said basically that strict constructionists are full of hooey. He said, yeah, the Constitution doesn't specifically say that Congress can create a bank, but it does say that they can pass all necessary and proper laws. So if they feel that a Bank of the United States is necessary and proper, then they have the constitutional authority to create it. Jefferson, who's still alive, getting very old and very cranky, super hates this decision. He basically hates every decision that the Marshall Court hands down. In 1807, James Monroe took office. He became essentially the last of the Virginia presidents. By this point, the Federalist Party is so weak that they only had tickets in 2 states and got almost no votes even there. So Monroe carried the entire country. One member of the Electoral College, as tradition dictated, threw his vote away so that Monroe's election would not be entirely unanimous, because nobody is supposed to top Washington. Monroe served 2 terms of office in a country that was basically a one-party country at this point. We sometimes call this the era of good feelings, because in a one-party country, you don't have, well, like the political battles that we have today. But there were still plenty of bad feelings under the surface. There may not be any party conflict, but the different sections of the United States began to compete for power, particularly the agricultural South and the industrial North. Even while party divisions faded into the background, the troublesome issue of slavery again threatened to disrupt national unity. In 1819, the Missouri Territory sent a request to Congress asking to form a constitution and prepare to be admitted as a state. The Missouri Territory was carved out of, partially carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. Missouri's slave population already exceeded 10,000. A representative from New York, James Talmadge, made a motion in Congress that if Missouri wants to become a state, they should be barred from bringing any more slaves into their territory, and that children of those already there should be freed at the age of 25. Well, that proposal sparked 2 years of controversy and fighting, and Republican unity, Democratic Republican unity, shattered along sectional lines. The Talmadge restriction passed in the House, where the North has a numerical superiority, but it died in the Senate, where slave states and free states had an equal number of votes. When Congress reconvened in 1820, the Senate passed a compromise with 3 parts, and this is the Missouri Compromise. Part 1. Missouri will be allowed to draft a constitution, a state constitution, without the Talmadge restriction. Part 2. The Northern Territory of Massachusetts will be carved away and turned into the state of Maine. And that way, with Missouri almost certainly becoming a slave state, and Maine being a free state, the balance of power in the Senate will be maintained. And Part 3, in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, all of this territory, slavery will be prohibited north of the 3630 line. Where'd my pointer go? Here it is. The 3630 line is the southern border of Missouri. Everything north of that must be free territory and therefore free states. Now, you can understand why Northern congressmen would support the Missouri Compromise, right? They get all of this territory up here in orange called the unorganized territory. How many states did we get out of that? I mean, that's Kansas, Nebraska, both Dakotas, Iowa, a little bit of Minnesota, to be honest, over there, Montana, part of Idaho, Colorado. So yeah, that's a lot of free states. But down here in the yellow part, what's called Arkansas Territory back then, that's 2. That's Arkansas and Oklahoma. And Oklahoma, they're not even thinking about turning into a state yet. It's essentially Indian territory at this point. So 2 slave states and like 8 bajillion free states. So then the question becomes, why did Southern politicians support this? On this map, it doesn't look like they're going to get very much. The reason why Southerners supported this is not for what they get right now in 1820. Right now in 1820, their part of the Louisiana Purchase is very small. They're thinking ahead. What they think they can do is eventually get this line, the Missouri Compromise line, extended all the way across the continent. Now, in 1820, that won't do them a dang bit of good because this is not U.S. territory. But they're thinking, you know, we might be able to get this away from Mexico. Ooh, then we might be able to get Central America. You know what? We could get South America too. So if we can extend this line and then somehow get all of this territory down to the frickin' tip of Argentina, down to Tierra del Fuego, that is a butt-ton of potential slave states. And all that the North gets is this, because we're not going to go to war with Britain to take Canada. Well, we're not going to do that again, right? We already tried that once. So the South is thinking ahead. They're thinking that they can claim all of this extra territory eventually. So a year later, 1821, Missouri proudly presents its steaming pile of a constitution to Congress. It not only protected slavery, it barred free black people from even entering the state. Now, this is a constitutional problem. Some northern states considered free black people to be citizens, and for them to be citizens in one state and not citizens in another state violates the Constitution. There is a part of the Constitution that requires each state to recognize the rights of citizens of other states. So Henry Clay came up with a second Missouri Compromise. In this new one, Congress would accept Missouri's state constitution as it was written, but the state of Missouri will be instructed that they cannot deprive the citizens of any state of their rights. So Missouri agreed, and then as soon as it became a state, they promptly ignored that part of the compromise. Now, some older politicians, like Jefferson, said that this whole Missouri controversy was fake news. It was trumped up by like the two remaining Federalists to try and break apart the Democratic Republican Party and revive the Federalist Party. But in reality, it was Northern Democratic Republicans who voted against slavery in Missouri. By 1820, New York had passed Virginia in population. New York was the biggest state in the country, and New York representatives were among the leading supporters of a free Missouri. We've had 28 years of Virginia presidents. Every president except John Adams up to this point has been a Virginia president. And that has persuaded many Northerners that the South has way too much influence in the federal government. And more slave states just means more Southern electoral votes and more frickin' Virginia presidents. The Missouri Compromise also raised what would become the fatal issue for the early United States, the westward expansion of slavery. The sectional divide that this issue revealed caused a lot of dismay, especially among older, more traditional political leaders. Jefferson wrote that this question was like a fire bell in the night. It awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it the death knell of the Union. He's not wrong. He's a little early, but he's not wrong. John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State at the time, wrote in his diary that it was terrible and threatening and might one day bring about a war. I mean, again, he's 40 years early, but he's not wrong. For the moment, the slavery issue faded from the national debate, but it's still there underneath. Now, in a way, it's kind of a shocker that Secretary of State John Quincy Adams thought that the nation might be in danger, because his entire career had been devoted to shoring up the national government here at home and overseas. Soon after the Missouri Compromise was settled, Adams took the opportunity to try and beef up America's role in the world. And he wants to do that by increasing our influence in Latin America. Between 1810 and 1821-22, Spain's Latin American colonies rose up in rebellion. They started to establish independent nations like Mexico and Venezuela and Ecuador and Peru. To the United States, these revolutions seemed to be modeled on our own struggle for independence, and that inspired a real wave of sympathy for them. In 1822, the Monroe administration, pushed along by Secretary of State Adams, became the first government to extend diplomatic recognition to these Latin American republics. Adams is afraid that Spain might come back and try to retake their colonies. So in 1823, he wrote a portion of the President's State of the Union address, which back then they weren't given as speeches, they were just letters that the President sent to Congress talking about what the State of the Union is. And part of it was written by Secretary of State Adams. And the part that Adams wrote came to be known as the Monroe Doctrine, because it was delivered by President Monroe. The Monroe Doctrine sets our foreign policy for the rest of the century. The Monroe Doctrine expresses really three ideas. First, the U.S. will not accept any more European colonization in the Americas. That is mostly aimed at Spain, but not only at Spain. France is putting the moves on Cuba. Russia has land out on the Pacific coast and they're looking to expand. We want all three of these guys to knock it off. Second, as long as Europe keeps its nose out of our hemisphere, we will keep our nose out of European business. Now, to be fair, the United States is absolutely unprepared and unequipped to stick our nose in Europe's business, so this is kind of us promising not to do something that we can't actually do, but still. And part three, European powers must not interfere in these new Latin American republics. Now, the Monroe Doctrine is sometimes called America's diplomatic Declaration of Independence. For many decades, it remained the cornerstone of our foreign policy. The underlying idea is that the old world and the new world have and ought to have separate political and diplomatic systems, and that in the Western Hemisphere, the United States ought to be the dominant power. Now, when Adams writes this, he has an economic goal in mind, not just a political goal. By this point, Latin America was becoming a major market for manufactured goods. Britain was heavily involved in mining and banking and commerce in Mexico and Venezuela, and especially Peru. Adams hoped that if the rest of the world respects the Monroe Doctrine, that would allow the United States to step in and take Britain's place and take Britain's money. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was part of this growing sense of American nationalism. But sectionalism, the needs of the different parts of the country, that seemed to rule our domestic politics. In the presidential election of 1824, only one candidate truly had national support, and that was Andrew Jackson, a veteran of the War of 1812. Now, Jackson's popularity had nothing to do with any policy, because he really had very few policy ideas, and the voters didn't care. Instead, he was popular because he was a big war hero. You know, he won Horseshoe Bend, he won the Battle of New Orleans. The other candidates were Secretary of State Adams, William Crawford, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Clay, Speaker of the House from Kentucky. Adams had a lot of support in New England. That's where he's from. His father was former President John Adams. The whole family's from Boston. Adams also has some support in other northern states, particularly the parts of the country that are becoming industrialized, that are getting the benefits of the American system, which he helps to promote. Crawford represents the old Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, the ones who want small federal government, local issues, states' rights. Henry Clay was one of the most popular politicians of this era, but his support as a presidential candidate was almost entirely in the frontier regions. Now, all four of these dudes are running from the same party. They are all Democratic Republicans. Now, the party's national caucus chose Crawford as their official candidate, but the other three guys were like, you know what, we're going to run anyway. We're getting to the point where a small group of officials no longer has total control over who runs for office. Now, Jackson, as you can see from the charts, got the most votes. Jackson got about 153,000 popular votes, 43% of the popular vote, 38% of the electoral vote, the most votes. But the most votes is not enough to win you the election. The most votes is called a plurality. A plurality. And in the United States, to win a presidential election, you need a majority. A majority is more than 50%. And with 4 candidates in the field, none of them got a majority. According to the Constitution, Henry Clay, who came in last, was eliminated, and the other 3 were tossed to the House of Representatives to decide. Since Henry Clay no longer had a dog in the race, he decided to throw his support behind John Quincy Adams. Now, Clay sincerely believed that Adams was the most qualified and the most likely to promote that American system of government-sponsored economic development that Clay so loved. Clay also sincerely hated Andrew Jackson. He believed that if Jackson came into power, Jackson would take control of the western states, where Clay himself was trying to build a power base. And with Clay's support, Adams was elected president by the House of Representatives. And then Adams made Henry Clay his Secretary of State. And that looked shady. Opponents of Clay and Adams said that Clay had made a corrupt bargain, that he had sold his integrity, that he had bartered votes in order to get this really prime job for himself. And that accusation clung to Henry Clay for the rest of his life. After this, he will never again be a viable candidate for the presidency. He'll still be popular in Congress, but he's not going to have a shot at the White House ever again. Now, the election of 1824 laid the groundwork for a new system of political parties. The Democratic-Republican Party shatters here. It's been on the ropes for a while, but it is absolutely destroyed in this election. Supporters of Jackson and Crawford united to form the Democratic Party. And this is the modern Democratic Party. I mean, some of their issues are different than what 21st century Democrats talk about. But in terms of a direct lineage that you can see from 1824 to 2000 whatever, this is the modern Democratic Party. Now, the alliance of Clay and Adams became the basis of the Whig Party. And that's W-H-I-G, not W-I-G. There's no wig snatching going on, which is really surprising because some congressional debates got super intense. But anyway, Clay and Adams' Whig Party. John Quincy Adams had one of the most distinguished pre-presidential careers of any American president. He was the son of former President John Adams. When he was 14, his father had sent him to Paris to work as an interpreter and a secretary to the American ambassador there. As an adult, he had himself been an ambassador to Prussia, to Russia, to the Netherlands, to Britain. He had been a senator from Massachusetts. As a senator, he had cast one of New England's few votes in favor of Jefferson's embargo, and he'd said that his region ought to rise above their petty sectional selfishness to defend the national good. And then he was forced to resign his seat because at the time of the embargo, you couldn't go around talking sense. Now, John Quincy Adams is brilliant, but he's not an engaging man. He described himself as a man of cold, austere, and foreboding manners, which may be a step up from his dad, right? His dad described himself as obnoxious and disliked. But John Quincy Adams, at least, had a really clear vision of potential national greatness. He strongly supports that American system of government-sponsored development. Overseas, he wants to encourage American trading and build up America's influence, especially in the Western Hemisphere. You know, as Monroe's Secretary of State, he's the one who created the Monroe Doctrine. He's the one who negotiated the U.S. getting Florida away from Spain. He's the one who got an agreement with Britain to set the American-Canadian border. He's the guy that did all of that. Adams' view of the power of the federal government, though, was much broader than his predecessors. In his first message to Congress, he talked about creating this comprehensive program to build an active national government. He supported federal laws promoting agriculture, and federal laws promoting commerce, and federal laws promoting manufacturing. He wanted to create a national university, a national observatory, a national naval academy. You know, this is a time period when many Americans felt that the biggest threat to freedom was the national government. Adams' plans were astonishing to them. He said that if the U.S. wanted to remain the freest nation on earth, it would also have to become the most powerful. But to strict constructionists, Adams is like a panic attack. His administration spent more money on internal improvements than his 5 predecessors combined. And he encouraged Congress to pass a very steep, very troublesome tariff in 1828 to help pay for that. Now, most of the rest of his ideas didn't get much support from Congress. It took until the 20th century for some of his educational and economic ideas to get any kind of support. Some of his proposals, like switching to the metric system, which is used by nearly every other country in the world, have yet to be implemented fully. We did try the metric system briefly in the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s. I barely remember it. What I remember is them putting speed limit signs with kilometers per hour on them, and people shot at them. So yeah, we're probably never going to switch to the metric system. Now, Adams' program and its vision of federal power handed his political opponents a very powerful weapon. They rallied behind the idea of a small federal government, states' rights, and individual freedoms, and they chose Andrew Jackson as their leader. Almost as soon as Adams took office in 1825, Jackson's supporters started gearing up for the next election. The job of overseeing it all went to Martin Van Buren, who was a friend of Jackson and a senator from New York. The clash between essentially Van Buren versus Adams demonstrated how democracy was changing the nature of American politics. Adams is very much the older, traditional style of politician. He comes from a political family. He is a man of sterling intellectual accomplishments. Van Buren, on the other hand, represents the new man. His dad owned a bar. He had almost no formal education. He's not a person of great intellect. And I know that sounds mean, but he did have some real talents. Van Buren was great with people. Van Buren understood people. He understood what drove them. He understood how to motivate them. He understood how to reach out to the little guy. Van Buren is a genius at that. And in particular, Van Buren was an awesome party manager. For the founding generation, they believed that political parties were divisive and dangerous, right? But Van Buren's not one of them. He's one of the younger generation. He says that political parties are not just necessary, they're good. He said that party competition would give voters an organized choice in elections. Van Buren said that individual voters can think about what they want, what they believe, and then instead of looking through 50 candidates, just look at the parties, see which party tends to match most of their beliefs, most of their needs, and then you vote for the candidates who are part of that party. Van Buren also hoped that organized political parties could help fight this growing sectionalism. He did not intend for his Democratic Party to only be popular in one part of the country. He wanted his party to deal with issues that voters everywhere could find at least something in their platform that those voters liked. He said that the parties, if they're run correctly, can bring together people from all different regions to support common candidates and common ideas. Like a lot of dudes, Van Buren had been really alarmed when politics became so divisive and sectional during the Missouri debates and during the 1824 election. And he blamed that sectionalism, in part, on a loss of discipline in the old Democratic-Republican Party. He said the U.S. needed to have a truly national party with broad-based national support to help keep the country together. By the election of 1828, Van Buren had created the apparatus of the Democratic Party. So he would have, in small towns, there would be local party units and local party leaders, and they would answer to county party leadership, and then the county leadership would answer to the state party leaders, and then the states would be overseen by the Democratic National Committee, which ought to sound familiar to you because that's pretty much how it operates now. Van Buren created that. Now, President Adams tries to ignore this. He tries to hold himself above all of this messiness. He refused to acknowledge that the new party even existed. He pretty much ignored his own Whig Party. Some federal office holders that he had appointed were outright campaigning for Jackson. And Henry Clay tried to get Adams to fire them, but he wouldn't do it because he's above politics. Adams really didn't help his re-election campaign at all. As for Jackson, Van Buren handled the whole thing for him. There was very little mention of policy or issues or campaign promises. Essentially, Jackson's campaign was, Jackson, I'd have a beer with him. The campaign of 1828 got really nasty, though. Jackson's supporters accused Adams of having a string of mistresses while he served as a diplomat in Europe. They said that Jackson was a real man. He's a frontiersman. Let's go to this pro-Jackson pamphlet here. They called Jackson Old Hickory. He's strong as a hickory tree. They ridiculed Adams for being educated. One of the slogans of the 1828 campaign literally said, "Vote for Jackson who can fight, not for Adams who can write." Jackson's opponents said that he was a murderer. He had done quite a bit of dueling in his youth and his middle age, and some in his old age. His opponents said that he'd been in so many duels and carried so many bullets still in his body that he rattled when he walked. That's an exaggeration. But when they started saying he was a murderer because he'd been in so many duels, most dudes around the country said, well, that's pretty awesome. So then they liked Jackson even more. So then the Adams camp, the Adams-Clay camp, said, well, he's a murderer because while he was an army officer, he executed deserters. But that's what he was supposed to do. That was his job. Every officer had to do that. That's what happened to deserters. And so then the Whigs went after his wife. Rachel Jackson was a divorced woman, sort of. You see, her first husband hadn't actually finalized the divorce before she married Andrew. And she and Andrew were illegally married for like 2.5 years before she found out. And so poor Rachel was technically a bigamist, and her marriage to Andrew Jackson was invalid. Now, once they found out about it, they got the first divorce finalized. Rachel and Andrew were officially married. And then it happened like 40 years before. She's an old lady by now. And during the campaign, Jackson's opponents dug up this dirt, called her an adulteress, said that she'd been living with a man without being married to him, so she's this and she's that and she's all these other nasty things. And it was so stressful for her that Rachel Jackson died of a heart attack before her husband was inaugurated. Andrew Jackson never forgave Adams or any Adams supporters for killing his wife. He said, "May God Almighty forgive her killers. I never can." That could be part of the reason why Jackson became so stubborn and intractable while he was president. Now, by 1828, voters in every state except South Carolina chose their own electoral college. So that helped to keep interest up, and it kept the campaigning really vigorous. Nearly 57% of eligible voters voted. That's more than double what we'd seen in 1824. And this time, Jackson wins 56% of the popular vote. He carries 17 states, the entire South, the entire West, along with Pennsylvania, and half of New York, which is a bizarre outcome that you would never see today. Now, Jackson's election demonstrated how much universal white male suffrage could change the government. For better or worse, the U.S. is about to enter the age of Jackson. Now, Jackson's a man of contradictions. He's got very little formal education. Adams called him a barbarian. But even though Jackson rarely wrote his own speeches, he was a very eloquent speaker. He tried to set himself up as the champion of the common man. But, of course, who counted as the common man was very limited. He excluded Native people who he wanted to push further west. He excluded African Americans. He supported slavery. He believed that black people who were already free ought to be sent to Africa. Jackson came from fairly modest beginnings. He became one of the richest men in Tennessee, and he did most of this because of the market revolution, but he was very suspicious of banks. He really didn't like paper money. He believed that the market revolution was causing moral decay. Now, Jackson, like Van Buren, is a nationalist, but he also believed that state governments, he said that he believed that state governments should have more power than the feds, and he opposed the government getting involved in the economy. Now, by the time Jackson became president, politics was much more than a series of contests. It was a spectacle. It was a form of mass entertainment. It was a part of daily life. Every year there was an election to some level of government, and millions of people took part in parades and rallies organized by the parties. Politicians were national celebrities. They had mass followings. Their fans gave them nicknames. Jackson's Old Hickory. Van Buren is the Little Magician, if you like him. If you don't like him, he's the Sly Fox. Henry Clay was called Harry of the West. Thousands of people went to very lengthy speeches and debates for fun. Daniel Webster, who was a senator from Massachusetts, was allegedly the greatest public speaker of this era. According to one estimate, 100,000 people attended one of his speeches. Now, party politics had become a well-oiled machine. These party machines were run by professional politicians, and they reached into every neighborhood, especially in the cities. So they would go into a really poor neighborhood, and they would find a man who needed a job, and they would say, vote Whig, and we will give you a little bit of money, or we'll give you a little bit of coal, because winter's coming on. And if you can get everyone in your tenement house or everyone on your block to vote Whig, and there's no secret ballot back then, so you can double check, then we'll give you a government job. They would gather up voters on election day and give them free transportation to the polls and watch them as they voted to make sure that they're voting for the right party's candidates. And if one of the party functionaries had done a very good job of organizing the votes, then he would be rewarded with, a high-level political office. Jackson called this the spoils system. The spoils of war should go to the victor, Jackson believed. So Jackson believes that every man who supports him, the men who work really hard on his behalf, he ought to just be able to hand out jobs to them like candy. Jackson said that government jobs ought to be open to the people, not be closed off just for those few bureaucrats who can read and write. So that's how we end up with postmasters who can't read the address on an envelope, or customs officials who can't read a manifest, and justices of the peace who do not know the law. It gets really exciting during Jackson's presidency. The national candidates, by the time Jackson runs for his second term, were being chosen in big national conventions, where state party delegates would gather to hammer out the platform and choose the official candidate, and newspapers became really important to politics. By 1830, there were nearly 400 newspapers across the country, and they're very, very partisan. They didn't so much report the actual news as they presented their party's position on the news. And Jackson had a group of newspapermen who would act as speechwriters and advisors. But there's more to party politics than just the spectacle of it. Jacksonian politics revolved around all of the questions raised by the market revolution and the tension between national and sectional loyalties. The central issues were how the government intends to handle the banks, or whether the government intends to handle the banks, what kind of a tariff we should have, how much of a tariff we should have, whether or not we should even have a tariff, whether or not the government should build roads and canals, what the balance of power should be between the states and the feds. And these questions really help to separate and define the two parties. Jackson's Democrats tended to say that they were worried about the widening gap between rich and poor. They didn't like the non-producing classes. They said bankers and merchants and speculators are non-producers. The producing classes are farmers and craftsmen, laborers, the people who actually make a thing, whereas bankers and merchants and speculators just profit by moving around what someone else has produced. So the Democrats tend to favor the producers, the farmers and the craftsmen. They do not want the government giving special privileges to the banks, corporations, big merchants. Whigs, on the other hand, united behind the American system of federally sponsored development. They believed that a protective tariff and a national bank and lots of money for roads and infrastructure would build the economy. The Whigs were strongest in the Northeast, in the most industrialized part of the country. Most established businessmen and bankers liked the Whig program, and so did farmers in the more developed areas like the canal zones and the Great Lakes, because they benefited from that economic change. The counties of upstate New York along the Erie Canal, they were Whig strongholds, but more rural New York communities tended to be Democratic. Many slave owners supported the Democrats too, because they believed that if their state governments had more power, then slavery would be protected. But if they were really, really rich, then they might vote Whig. Now, the party battles of the Jacksonian era reflect a clash also between public and private definitions of freedom and how those ideas of freedom relate to federal power. Jackson and the Democrats said that liberty was a private thing that was best helped along by local government, with the national government staying out of it. They said that the only way to keep liberty safe was to keep the federal government from having power. And while Jackson was president, some of the powers of the federal government were weakened. Jackson believed that was necessary for private freedom and for states' rights. Democrats said that privileges granted by the federal government were the source of inequality, things like corporate charters. And so during Jackson's presidency, the Democrats in Congress did briefly reduce federal spending. They did lower the tariff, they did kill the national bank, and they refused to pay for any road or canal construction, or even repair on the roads and canals we already had. By 1835, Jackson had managed to pay off the national debt. And as a result, states became the most powerful sector of the government, especially in economic issues. Under Jackson, it was the states that chartered banks. It's the states that planned canals and railroads, until Jackson's financial problems start to catch up with them, but we'll get to that later. Jackson also said that your individual morality was private, not public. This is an era when there are all sorts of reform groups around, trying to push their vision of a good moral society onto everybody. There was a temperance movement. They want to limit or outlaw the sale of liquor. Jackson doesn't like that. He says it's not their business. There are reform groups who want stricter blue laws. So blue laws are things like you can't sell alcohol on a Sunday, you can't cuss in public, those kinds of things. Dance halls have to be closed on Sunday. Those are blue laws. Jackson doesn't like those. Jackson says if you think it's immoral to dance on Sunday, that's fine. You don't dance on Sunday. But you can't force your neighbor to not dance. These particular reform movements were, especially the temperance movement, were also firmly linked to anti-immigrant sentiment. The big wave of immigration that began in the 1830s was made up mostly of Irish and German Catholics, and their cultures and their religion really didn't have a problem with a man having a pint after work or after church. And they are resentful of these mostly Protestants who are trying to force them to behave as if they were Protestants themselves. So these immigrants often supported the Democrats too. Some people began to look at laws and look at policy not so much to see if those policies promote the common good, but to see if those policies will just leave everyone alone. They believed that laws were supposed to give room for individuals to make their own decisions and pursue their own interests and develop themselves without outside restrictions. Well, laws were supposed to leave room for white men to do those things. Now, on the other hand, you've got the Whigs. The Whigs said that really free people need a strong national government. They said that a weak government is a threat to your liberty, but a strong government can protect your freedom. Whigs believed that real liberty needs everyone in the country to be prosperous and to be moral. They said that the government should create the conditions for balanced, regulated economic development. The government should promote a prosperity where all classes and all regions will be uplifted. But wealthy Whigs were often similar to the old Federalists. They do kind of view society as a hierarchy, whereas Democrats tended to see the world as unrestrained individual competition. But unlike the old Federalists, the Whigs insisted that social class was not fixed. It's not something that you always have to be in. They said that in a good government that is working correctly, any individual should be able to work hard and achieve. That's the American dream. The Whigs also reject the idea that your private life and your personal morality was off limits. The Whigs said that truly free people have certain character traits, and a strong government can help to promote those traits. They said that the government needs to actively support the general welfare, and that included making the people into the correct kind of people. Many evangelical Protestants support the Whigs because they believe that public education and temperance laws and things like that can help create a more moral, successful nation. You can kind of think of it in this way. John Quincy Adams is a Whig. He is a New Englander, and New England had been founded by Puritans. And if you recall, I know it's been a couple weeks, Puritans very strongly believed that public behavior needed to be regulated. There's no real thing as private morality. Puritans did not support the idea that a man can decide his religion and his beliefs for himself. New England was a Whig stronghold in part because the Whigs had such Puritan ideals. State and local governments that were controlled by Whigs passed many laws and ordinances that tried to shape public morals by banning alcohol and prostitution and swearing and having theaters open on Sundays, all sorts of things. Now, it's been said that Jackson left office with more principles than he came in with. He was elected essentially as a military hero, backed by a very efficient party machine. But while he was in office, he actually had to dig in and think about some very difficult issues. Despite his campaign commitment to states' rights, Jackson's first term was really dominated by a battle to prove that federal law was supreme over state law. And a lot of that battle came about because of Jackson's personality. I don't remember if I've said this before, but if I have, bear with me, and if I haven't, then new information. It's easy to think about history as inevitable. Like where we are, we can look back and we can see these things that happened, and from our perspective, it becomes really easy to think that those things had to happen. But so much of what happens in the world, so much of what we treat as inevitable history, is actually pushed along by the individual personalities of the people involved. And it's really easy to see that in things that are happening right now. But when we look back in the past, we have a different view of long ago people. Almost this assumption that, of course, they were making the right decisions, and of course they were acting rationally, and blah, blah, blah. And often they really weren't. The world doesn't have to be the way that it is. If they just made a different decision, which they could have, which was absolutely open to them. Jackson does not like to be challenged. Now, he campaigns on the idea of states' rights. And I think he does believe in that. But when he is the president, he sees himself as the embodiment of the national government. The national government is Jackson, Jackson is the government, and so a challenge to the national government he sees as a challenge to himself. Now, this is all a long-winded way to get into the nullification crisis. If the nullification crisis had happened while Jackson was not president, he would almost certainly have supported nullification. But because he is president, any challenge to the federal government is a challenge to him, and he can't support that. So nullification came about because of the Tariff of 1828. We talked about that. That was passed to support John Quincy Adams' development, right? The Tariff of 1828 had raised taxes on imported goods made of wool, raised taxes on raw materials like iron, and that had created a major backlash in the South. In particular, the state of South Carolina. They called it the Tariff of Abominations. The leaders of South Carolina had decided that it wasn't even possible for them to compete with the North in industry, so they weren't even trying. This tariff, which protects manufactured goods, did nothing at all to help South Carolina or any other undeveloped southern state. So South Carolina said that this tariff was, in effect, taxing them, that the tariff is making it more expensive for southern farmers to get the equipment that they need, and all of the benefit from the tariff is going to the North. So South Carolina says the tariff is essentially a tax on the South to benefit the North. They say that's not constitutional, so the South Carolina legislature threatened to nullify the tariff A nullification, the idea of it, goes back to the Kentucky Resolution that Jefferson wrote during the Alien and Sedition kerfuffle, right, in 1798. Now it's 1828, and South Carolina's like, oh, there's an idea we can use. They want to declare this tariff null and void in their state and say that citizens of South Carolina will not pay it. Now, South Carolina had the largest proportion of slaves. They had 55% of their population enslaved. And it was controlled by a really tightly knit group of large planters. And they kept their grip on power by having a state constitution that gave plantation counties a lot more seats in the state legislature than really they ought to have had. They also had very high property qualifications for office holders. So most white men in South Carolina could vote, but they could really only choose between one large planter or a different large planter. And those powerful, wealthy men had been very alarmed by the Missouri crisis and by the steady buildup of national power under these nationalist presidents and the Supreme Court. The issue that they're complaining about right now is the tariff, but underneath that issue is a much bigger one. They believe that the federal government must be weakened, or eventually the federal government will come after slavery. John Calhoun is from South Carolina. John Calhoun was a war hawk during the War of 1812. He was one of the big nationalist leaders, one of the compromisers, worked with Henry Clay. Calhoun soon became the leader of the nullification cause. As the South began to fall behind the rest of the country in development and population, Calhoun had become a powerful defender not of American nationalism, but of Southern sectionalism. But at this point, Calhoun is Jackson's vice president. And if he knows anything about Andrew Jackson, it's that Jackson likes to shoot at people who challenge him. So Calhoun tries to stay behind the scenes. He doesn't want to tick off Jackson. And he wrote this exposition as a justification for nullification with a pseudonym. He published it under a fake name. Now, his justification for this nullification thing drew heavily on the arguments from the Kentucky Resolution that Jefferson wrote about the Alien and Sedition Acts. Calhoun said that the federal government had been created by an agreement between sovereign states, and that each state should retain the right to not enforce laws that that state feels violates the Constitution. Now, even though Calhoun is Jackson's vice president, Calhoun does not have much real influence over Jackson. In fact, things are getting a bit chilly between them in the White House, and Jackson doesn't even know that Calhoun is challenging his authority in this way. The reason why Jackson and Calhoun aren't really talking to each other has nothing to do with politics and everything to do with Jackson being Jackson. It was sort of a Mean Girls situation. Jackson's Secretary of War had married a woman who was not a lady. She was not of the upper class. Her father was a tavern keeper. And so the ladies of Washington from like wealthy families, they used to whisper behind their hands that, she was a woman of easy virtue and she'd, done all of these things. And the leader of the Washington Mean Girls was John Calhoun's wife. Jackson is obviously opposed to the Washington Mean Girls because from his perspective, it's exactly that kind of talk that had killed his own wife. So he is extremely sympathetic toward this woman. Her name was Peggy Eaton. Van Buren was very sympathetic toward Peggy Eaton. Van Buren and Jackson are both widowers. They don't have wives to be part of the Harpy group there. And so Calhoun got blamed for his wife acting like a jerk. And pretty soon Jackson and Calhoun can't agree on anything at all. And so Calhoun can't even bring up the possibility of supporting nullification to Jackson. Jackson just will not hear it. And the nullification debate raged all over D.C. Daniel Webster, that senator from Massachusetts, he became the leader of the anti-nullification side. He argued that the Constitution was not created by the states. It was created by the people. He also pointed out that the Constitution said federal law is the supreme law of the land. He said that nullification was illegal, unconstitutional, and treasonous. And a few weeks later, Calhoun stepped out of the shadows and acknowledged that he was the leader of the pro-nullification side. He had very bad timing about it, though. He did it at a White House dinner party while he was standing next to Andrew Jackson. Allegedly, when Jackson left office, he told his aides that he only had two regrets: that he didn't shoot Henry Clay and he didn't hang John Calhoun. Now, nullification was not entirely a sectional issue. The rest of the South did not join South Carolina in this crusade. In fact, several different Southern states passed resolutions condemning South Carolina's nullification. But still, the theory of nullification gave the South a well-developed political philosophy to kind of hang their hat on. And this is a philosophy that they will use again over the question of slavery. Now, Calhoun argued that nullification is not a step on the road to disunion and secession. He said that it's the only way to ensure that a big, diverse country isn't trampling on the individual rights of states. But to Jackson, nullification was nothing less than disunion and treason. And the issue came to a real head in 1832. Seriously, these dudes duked it out for 3.5 years. In 1832, Congress passed a new tariff, and this was supposed to make South Carolina happy. This new tariff actually reduced the tax rates. It's meant to appease South Carolina so they will stop the nullification thing. South Carolina declared this new tax also null and void. And Jackson gets Congress to pass a law that allows the president to send the army into South Carolina to forcibly collect these customs duties. That is very close to war. I mean, we really almost had a civil war here in 1832. To stop that from happening, while Jackson is trying to build up the army to invade South Carolina, Henry Clay sat down and worked with Calhoun, came up with another compromise. They wrote up a new tariff that would reduce the taxes even further. Calhoun went back to South Carolina and essentially told them, look, if you don't agree to this new tariff, I know we don't like tariffs, right? None of us like it. We don't want to pay it. We still think it's unconstitutional, but you have to agree to pay this one, or we're all going to die. And so Calhoun rescinded their nullification order on the old tariff. They agreed that they would pay this new one. Then they nullified the Force Act, which was supposed to allow Jackson to attack them. That's basically symbolic. That nullification was South Carolina saying, we reject your right to use the army against us, even though you are already marching toward us with guns, and we can't actually stop you. Calhoun jumped ship. He left the Democratic Party entirely over this issue. He joined the Whigs. And between Calhoun and Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, they formed a very formidable trio of leaders, even though these three dudes agreed on almost nothing except their mutual hatred for Andrew Jackson. It is kind of ironic that Jackson, who said he was such a firm believer in states' rights and in limiting the national government, did more than anybody else to give such an emotional aura to the idea of the Union and to be willing to go to war to preserve the national government's power over the states. Now, in his second term of office, Jackson is going to strongly support states' rights over a very different issue. This is the Indian removal crisis. The last coordinated Indian resistance in the Old Northwest came in 1832. That was Black Hawk's War. Federal troops routed the Sauk Nation, who had been trying to reclaim their land in Illinois and push them west of the Mississippi. In the South, the onward march of the Cotton Kingdom put enormous pressure on the remaining tribes. In Missouri, one of their senators said that the U.S. must convert Indian soil into slave soil. And during the 1820s, Missouri forced as much of their Indian population as they could to leave the state. And then that policy of expulsion spread to the older slave states. One of the early laws of the Jackson administration, one that was passed during his first term, was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. That technically applied to every tribe still living east of the Mississippi. But we usually talk about it in terms of the 5 civilized tribes. The Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. Between those 5 tribes, there were probably 60,000 people. They lived in the Carolinas and Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. When Congress passed that law, and when the president signed it, they were turning their back on that old Jeffersonian idea that civilized Indians, air quotes over civilized here, can become assimilated into the United States. Those 5 nations had made tremendous efforts to become everything that the U.S. government told them that they should. To do what they had been told would make them citizens. The Cherokee had kind of taken the lead. They built schools, they had written laws, they had a constitution. Many of them were successful farmers, many of them owned slaves, just like their white neighbors. In fact, many Cherokee leaders, including John Ross, who was the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, many of them had served alongside Jackson during the War of 1812. John Ross had more formal education than Andrew Jackson did. But in Jackson's messages to Congress supporting removal, Jackson repeatedly called the Cherokee savages, and he supported the state of Georgia's efforts to seize their land and to nullify the Cherokee Nation's laws. Now, Jackson had not supported nullification when it was South Carolina wanting to do it to U.S. law, but when the state of Georgia wants to nullify the laws of another sovereign nation, laws that don't really affect Georgia at all, except to make them acknowledge that this other nation exists, that's okay by Jackson. Well, the free citizens of the Cherokee Nation petitioned Congress for help. And in good American fashion, Cherokee leaders also went to court to protect their rights, which had been guaranteed in treaties with the federal government. The Constitution specifically says that only the federal government can make treaties and land purchases with Indian nations. And there are a couple of Supreme Court cases that are important here. The first one is Cherokee Nation v. Georgia. In Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, that's the Cherokee Nation itself suing the state of Georgia. Georgia had passed ridiculous laws. Georgia had said that the Cherokee can't mine for gold. Many of the Cherokee lived in the mountains in Georgia where there actually was gold there, and on their own land. And Georgia's saying, it might be on your land, but we're not going to let you mine for it. Georgia had tried to nullify the Cherokee Nation's constitution, said that the Cherokee tribal government cannot hold meetings, said that there can be no more elections inside the Cherokee Nation, said that any missionary, who are always white, any missionary who goes to the Cherokee Nation has to swear an oath of allegiance to the state of Georgia. That right there is super unconstitutional. You do not swear an oath of loyalty to a state, not ever. Your loyalty is to the United States, to the nation, not to an individual state. But anyway, so the Cherokee Nation sues the state of Georgia. And in this Supreme Court case, Chief Justice John Marshall, still there, described Indians as wards of the federal government. He said that they deserved paternal protection, but because they were not citizens, they didn't have standing to sue. And therefore, the court did not have the authority to protect their rights against the state of Georgia. Now, Marshall didn't want to make that decision. When he gets another chance to try and protect the rights of the Cherokee Nation and other tribes, he will do that. He has to make that decision in this case because the Cherokee are not citizens. And without standing to sue, he cannot constitutionally decide in their favor. Marshall strongly believed that the federal government is supreme over the states. He really does not like what Georgia is doing. So a couple of years later, in 1832, the Supreme Court gets a chance to rule against Georgia. This is the case of Worcester v. Georgia. Worcester v. Georgia. That's W-O-R-C-E-S-T-E-R. Worcester v. Georgia. This case was brought not by a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, but by one of the missionaries to the Cherokee Nation. This man had been arrested by the state of Georgia for refusing to swear an oath of loyalty to Georgia. So he is a U.S. citizen. He has standing to sue, and he does. So in this case, the court can do what it wanted to do the first time. In this case, the court found that Indian nations were a distinct, sovereign people with the right to maintain a separate political identity. The court held that they must be dealt with only by the feds, not by the states, and therefore Georgia's actions had violated federal treaties. Now, Jackson had spent the entire nullification crisis trying to make the feds supreme over the states. And here's John Marshall saying, yes, the feds are supreme over the states. So you'd think Jackson would be happy about that, but he was not happy. Jackson said that the Worcester ruling was invalid. Allegedly, he said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. The Cherokee found their legal avenues blocked. If the president will not enforce a Supreme Court ruling, there's no protection. So one faction, one very small, non-elected, non-representative faction, agreed to sign a treaty to cede their lands to the federal government. Now, the majority of Cherokee are not involved in this. The majority of Cherokee are led by John Ross, the principal chief. No one who was elected to the Cherokee national government was a part of the treaty party. These guys, Major Ridge, his son, Elias Boudinot, Stand Watie, the pro-treaty guys, they are not democratic representatives of the Cherokee people. What they are afraid of is that if they don't sign a treaty, they will be violently forced off their land. And they're not wrong about that. So they sign the Treaty of New Echota. The Treaty of New Echota. They agree to cede the lands of the Cherokee Nation east of the Mississippi in exchange for lands west of the Mississippi in Indian Territory. The treaty party leave. They head out to Indian Territory, partly to get the good land first and partly because everybody else wants to kill them. The majority of the Cherokee try passive resistance. The rest of the Cherokee Nation, the vast majority of the nation who do not support this treaty, they just stay. They petition Congress. Congress won't even debate it. They contact senators and say, do not ratify this treaty. Nobody will really listen to them. The time for them to leave, according to this treaty, came and went, and eventually they were rounded up by federal troops in the summer of 1838. Jackson was out of office by this point, Martin Van Buren's president, but he carried out Jackson's plan. The army herded 18,000 men, women, and children into internment camps with very little food and no fresh water, and then forced them to move west, most of them on foot. They took different pathways, but most of the routes that they took into Indian Territory were about 2,200 miles long on foot. They traveled over the winter without transportation, without adequate clothing and blankets and food. They didn't reach the Tahlequah area until early 1839. At least a quarter of the nation died on the Trail of Tears, although some estimates go as high as a third, which would be 6,000 people. And we don't know exactly how many because the army officers who were forcing them to move didn't let them stop and make real graves for people. They've found recently some mass graves along the trail, but we really don't know how many people were lost. We know that John Ross's wife died on this march. During the 1830s, other southern tribes faced the same choice. You can leave or you can be forced. The Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, they all signed treaties. They tried to do what they thought would get them the best outcome. For most of them, there is no best outcome. The Seminole, together with the fugitive slaves that they had adopted, they resist. In the Second Seminole War, which lasted from about 1835 to 1842, about 1,500 American soldiers were killed trying to force the Seminole out of their traditional homeland. Eventually, about 3,000 Seminole were forced west. They became the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. But some Seminole, because of this war, were able to remain in their homeland. And so there is also a Seminole Nation in Florida. While all of this is going on, there's a really popular book that's been published. It's called A Son of the Forest, and it's by a man named William Apis. He's a descendant of Metacom, the man that the English called King Philip. And A Son of the Forest is the first really significant autobiography by a Native American. Apis was a son of a white man and a Native mother who was descended from Metacom. He had served with the U.S. forces during the War of 1812. He had become a Methodist minister, and his book asked for harmony between the races. It was considered kind of controversial at the time because he turned the idea of what civilization is on its head. He said that the white government of the United States and the individual states was not civilized. He actually said, how much better would it be if the whites would act like civilized people? And he pointed out that when white people asked stupid questions like, what is it these Indians want? That any rational man would see that all people want to be treated fairly. And his book argues for coexistence, but the U.S. government opted for removal instead. Removal powerfully reinforced the racial definition of American nationhood and freedom. At the time of the Revolution, Native people were a very familiar presence in many parts of the U.S. But by 1840, in the eyes of most white Americans east of the Mississippi, Native people were a curiosity, a relic of a bygone era. So Jackson has almost caused a civil war. He has contributed to the deaths of thousands of people. Wonder what his next trick is going to be. Oh yeah, let's wreck the economy. The central political struggle of the Jacksonian age was the President's War on the Bank of the United States. The bank symbolized all of the hopes and all of the fears of the market revolution. The expansion of banking had helped to pay for a lot of development. But many Americans, including Jackson, distrusted bankers as non-producers, as people who contribute nothing but profit from the labor of others. And the banks didn't really help their cause. They were still overissuing paper money, and when the value went down, it hit regular people very hard. Jackson himself had long believed that only specie, only gold and silver, was honest currency. Paper money is not real. But when he took office, there was no reason to believe that he would launch an all-out war on the banks. But the head of the Second Bank of the United States is a guy kind of like Jackson. His name is Nicholas Biddle. He's from Pennsylvania. And during the 1820s, when he became the head of the Second Bank of the United States, he had become very good at using the power of the bank to do what it was supposed to do, to, from Jackson's perspective, bully smaller banks into keeping their currency strong. But that is what the bank is supposed to do. Doing that helps keep the U.S. economy stable. Now, Biddle is just as stubborn as Jackson is. He is not going to back down in a fight. In 1832, Biddle told Congress that his bank was powerful enough to destroy any state bank. Now, he said they would never actually do that unless there was a reason to. But that got Jackson all upset. He said Biddle shouldn't have that much power. He called the Bank of the United States the Monster Bank, said it was an evil union between political and economic privilege. And the issue came to a head in 1832 during the presidential election. The charter for the Second Bank of the United States was supposed to expire in 1836. Under normal conditions, the bank would wait until 1836 and then ask for Congress to reauthorize that charter for another 20 years. Biddle decides to do it early. He asks in 1832 for Congress to reauthorize that charter, and then he goes to Jackson because the president needs to sign that charter. And he tells Jackson, you recharter the bank now or we will destroy your campaign. And Jackson's not going to take that, so he promised to kill off the bank. Jackson vetoed this new charter. He attached a message, as presidents do when they veto, and his veto message is maybe the central philosophical document of his presidency. Jackson said that in a democracy, it is unacceptable for Congress to create concentrated power and privilege that is not accountable to the people. Now remember, the Bank of the United States was a private corporation. Its officers were not chosen by the people of the United States. They were chosen by stockholders. Jackson said that privileges like this bank's charter widened the gap between the rich and the poor, and Jackson is going to stand up as the defender of the poor. Now, the bank war reflected how Jackson had built up the power of the presidency during his terms. He said that the president ought to represent the people. And Jackson really was the first president to use the veto as a major political weapon and to appeal directly to the public over the head of Congress. Now, Whigs in Congress denounce Jackson. They say that he is taking more power than the Constitution says a president should have, even though the Constitution specifically does allow the veto. But the Whigs said that Congress is supposed to represent the people. How dare Jackson think he does? But Jackson was very effective at appealing to popular sentiment. He won a sweeping re-election victory in 1832, and then he killed the bank just like he said he would. Now, how does he do that? The charter, the original charter, is still in effect until 1836. There's got to be some way to get rid of them, though. I mean, Jackson could just let the charter die out, but that's not who Jackson is. There are two very different groups of people who want to see The second Bank of the United States absolutely destroyed. First, you've got state banks who do not like Biddle's regulations. They want to be able to issue more paper currency. And the second group are those hard money advocates, people like Jackson, people who oppose all banks and believe that gold and silver are the only honest currency. During Jackson's second term, the state banks are on the rise. They are not content to wait for the second bank's charter to expire in 1836. They want it gone now, or at least be made so weak that it can't bother them. So what Jackson wants to do is pull all of the federal government's money out of the bank, out of the Bank of the United States, and deposit that into local banks. Without the federal government's money, Nicholas Biddle and the Bank of the United States will not be able to operate. They won't be able to do the regulating that they're supposed to do. They won't be able to issue their own money. They won't be able to even pay the people who work for them. So they will effectively go out of business 4 years early. So Jackson wants to take the money away from them and give it to local banks. And not surprisingly, political and personal connections determined how Jackson chose the banks that will get the money. Those banks became known as Jackson's pet banks. Jackson put a lot of federal money into the Main Bank of Portland, where the director was related to one of his cabinet members. The Planters Bank of Savannah was recommended by one of his friends. But Jackson's Secretary of the Treasury refused to transfer the money. The Bank of the United States still has its charter until 1836, and that charter is actually a law. If they pull the money out, that's a violation of the law. The president's not supposed to do that. The president is supposed to enforce the law. So Jackson fired his Secretary of the Treasury. He got a new person in, told the new guy, I want you to take the money out of here, put it over here. And the new guy read the law. He said, man, I understand what you want to do. I totally sympathize, but I can't break the law. So Jackson fired him too. Second Secretary of the Treasury was confirmed in May. He was out by September. Jackson got a third Secretary of the Treasury. This dude's name is Roger Taney. Roger Taney. That is a good name to remember. Taney looked at the law. He said, Mr. President, it is totally illegal for me to do what you want me to do. But you know what? I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. Taney carried out Jackson's order to transfer all of that money to the pet banks. And Jackson is so happy that when John Marshall dies, Jackson rewards Roger Taney by appointing him to be the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So now we've got a guy in charge of the Supreme Court who doesn't give a shit what the law says. That's going to be an awesome situation. You can't see my sarcastic face, but I promise you it's there. Without the government money, the second bank lost its ability to regulate the state banks. The state banks start issuing more and more paper money. They want to finance the expansion of industry in the north, the expansion of agriculture in the south. They want to pay for canals and railroad projects. The face value of banknotes in circulation rose from $10 million in 1833 to $150 million just 4 years later. Now, we don't have any more gold. We don't have 15 times as much gold to back that up. This is 15 times more paper money with no real value to it. Without the Bank of the United States being able to regulate the money and make sure that there's actual specie to back it up, the real purchasing power of that paper money declines. So we get a period of massive inflation where $1 in paper cannot buy half of what it used to. As a result, real wages, the actual value of a worker's pay, declined. Labor unions start to spread, trying to protect, the earnings of factory workers. Speculators rush to cash in on rising land prices. They use this increasingly worthless paper money, to buy up huge blocks of government land. States used paper money to fund tens of millions of dollars of canal construction and road construction, and inevitably, the whole thing collapsed. In 1836, the government sold 10 times as many acres of federal land than what they'd sold in 1830. And nearly all of it was paid for in worthless paper money. In July of 1836, the Jackson administration issued a document called the Specie Circular. The Specie Circular. The Specie Circular said that from this point on, the federal government will only accept gold and silver as payment. The U.S. government will no longer accept U.S. paper money in payment. So America's creditors, foreign countries and foreign banks that had lent us money, they become very suspicious about the value of American banknotes, which our government is still trying to use to pay off our debt to other countries. When the president says, we're not going to take this paper money because it's worthless, then the Bank of London is like, then why are you trying to pay us in that paper money? So they demand that the U.S. government and American merchants only pay their debts in gold and silver. We don't have that much gold and silver. Then the demand for American cotton dropped. Then the demand for American grain dropped. And all of it together triggered a massive economic collapse. The Panic of 1837. The depression that followed it lasted for 6 years. In the first year of the downturn, prices fell by 25%. That's not a good thing. That's not like a nationwide 25% off sale. When prices fall that far across the board, yeah, you can buy more stuff if you still have a job. But when prices fall, businesses fail and unemployment goes up. Many farmers lost income, then they lost their farms. Tens of thousands of factory workers lost their jobs. The labor movement just collapsed. Nobody wanted to go on strike because they're all so desperate just to hang on to the job that they have. No matter how badly it pays and no matter how unsafe it is, at least it's a job. By 1842, 9 states were bankrupt. A lot of it is just irresponsible crap. The state governments, it used to be legal for state governments to take your state taxes that you pay for roads and bridges and schools and police. It used to be legal for the states to take your money and invest it in corporations. In the 1820s, that had done okay. The economy was growing, and it was growing pretty steadily. So the states were turning your tax money into more money that they could use to benefit you. But when this panic hits, it wipes out the state budgets. During the 1840s, after this panic, most state legislatures changed their constitutions to specifically outlaw that kind of behavior. Now, Jackson kind of caused this panic. Jackson is the guy that hated the Bank of the United States so much that he gutted it. And without it there acting as a regulator, the state banks went haywire. But Jackson's not the president who had to deal with the problem. He doesn't have to deal with the fallout. Jackson served his 2 terms. He left office in March of 37. The poor guy who's got to deal with it is Martin Van Buren. Now, Van Buren is not the greatest thinker, but he does actually have a really good idea for how to handle this. Van Buren has this idea that he calls the independent treasury. The independent treasury. Van Buren says, instead of taking all the government's money and putting it in a private bank, whether it's this national bank or whether it's the local banks, maybe we should put it in the Treasury Department in Washington, under the control of government officials who are actually answerable to the people. Crazy thought. Now that means that those state banks cannot use that money for investment, but at least the money will be safe. The Independent Treasury Plan split the Democratic Party. Business-oriented Democrats strongly oppose it. Many of them are involved with Jackson's pet banks. They don't want to lose that money. They don't want that money to go into the Treasury Department. They want it for themselves. So some of them just leave the Democratic Party entirely. They defect and go to the Whig Party. Now, small farmers, factory workers, they support Van Buren. They hate banks and paper money in general. They see how badly they've been hurt by all of this nonsense. Some of the states' rights Democrats who had hated Jackson, guys like John Calhoun, who had left the Democrats over the nullification thing, they come back. Now that Jackson's out of office, they want to support the independent treasury. But the bankers in the party are still so against it. Van Buren's got a good reputation as this political magician, but he doesn't have Jackson's popularity. And by himself, he cannot hold the party together. By the election of 1840, Van Buren is facing a lot of challenges within his own party from people who hate his independent treasury idea. And he's also facing challenges from the Whigs, who have taken all of his campaign techniques that he used before and are using them for their own candidate now. The Whigs choose William Henry Harrison as their candidate for president. Harrison he's essentially the Whig version of Andrew Jackson. He is a popular military hero. He's the hero of Tippecanoe, where he defeated Tecumseh. He doesn't have a lot of real political opinions. The Whigs don't bother to run him on a platform. The Whigs run Harrison the way Van Buren had run Jackson. He's an awesome dude. You can sit down and have a beer with him. They flooded the U.S. with banners and parades and mass meetings. They said Harrison is a man of the people, just like Jackson was. They called him the log cabin candidate. They said he's a man who's raised himself up from nothing. Now that is not even close to the truth. Harrison was born on one of the biggest, oldest plantations in Virginia, but, you know, they don't have Snopes back then. So Harrison's supporters were able to take the career that he'd had in Indiana and say, oh, he's a frontiersman, he's a self-made man, and kind of ignore all of the privileges that he'd had growing up. In kind of a funny twist of fate, the Whigs denounced Van Buren as an aristocrat. Van Buren, whose dad ran a bar. They said that Van Buren had been wasting the people's tax money on gold spoons and fine furniture, which is only like half true. By this point in history, both parties have learned two very important lessons. First, you paint your candidate as the defender of the common man, and second, you lie. For Harrison's running mate, the Whigs chose John Tyler, who wasn't even really a Whig. Tyler was a states' rights Democrat from Virginia. He joined the Whigs during the nullification crisis, and he stayed there because he thought his chances of getting into office were better with the Whigs. But in all of his ideals, Tyler is firmly a Democrat on almost every issue. What Tyler wants to do is the complete opposite of what the Whigs want to do. But party leaders want him. They believe that Southerners will vote for Tyler. Have you ever heard the terms dino and rhino? Democrat in name only, Republican in name only. That's the way that we mock politicians who belong to a party but don't really seem to do what the party wants. So sometimes you've got somebody in Congress who's, a Republican and was elected as a Republican, but then they vote against tax cuts, and then people will go, oh, he's just a rhino, he's just a Republican in name only. Well, John Tyler is a wino. He is a Whig in name only. By 1840, the mass democratic politics of this era has kind of absorbed all of the lessons of the market revolution. The parties sell their candidates to the public. They sell their candidates' image and made up stories, and they ignore the real political issues. The parties have learned that if you make the package pretty, the voters won't look too closely at what's inside. Now, with two highly motivated, very organized parties competing, voter turnout soared. 80% voter turnout in the election of 1840, and Harrison won a sweeping victory. Now, the Whig Party is thrilled, but their success is short-lived. Harrison, when he was inaugurated in March of 41, gave the longest inaugural speech ever. That would have been bad enough. But it was a cold and rainy day. Harrison caught pneumonia, and he died a month to the day after he took office. So that leaves John Tyler, the wino, to be president. Tyler spent his entire term as president vetoing almost every single piece of law that the Whigs passed. Most of his cabinet resigned. The Whig Party repudiated him. Whig newspapers called Tyler his accidency instead of his excellency, although at least a couple of them called him the executive ass. Now, Tyler's 4 years in office had almost no real accomplishments, and that proved how important political parties had become. Tyler was elected vice president on the strength of very strong Whig Party campaigning. And as president, he learned that he could not govern without the party behind him. And while Tyler's president, a storm starts a-brewing that will test how stable American democracy really is. And we will get to that later.